approach the vehicle, look for leaks, such as dripping fluids or puddles under the engine or the underside of the engine. Check my lights, make sure they're clean. All the clearance lights, make sure they're not broken, missing, in proper color. Open the compartment. Don't put this on YouTube. They're gonna be like, look at this weak motherfucker. Check my exhaust. Make sure it's connected tightly, mounted securely.
Hey, Kurt.
No loose clamps. No signs of damage. No signs of leaking, such as carbon soot or rust. Check all my clamps under the vehicle. Follow it to the front of the engine. And right here by the turbo. I'm gonna check my engine hoses, make sure they're in good condition, not leaking. Check my alternator, make sure it's mounted securely. Make sure the wires are fastened properly. I'm gonna check, it's belt driven, so I'll check the belt. Make sure it has no visible cracks, it's not frayed, no signs of wear, no loose fibers. By hand, I'll check the deflection of the belt, make sure it's not more than a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. Make sure it's snug. Check my water pump, make sure that it's mounted securely and not leaking. It's gear driven. Then I'm gonna check my oil, make sure it's above the refill mark and within safe operating range. Get up here, check my coolant, make sure my coolant level is within adequate level. Check my engine hoses over here, make sure they're in good condition, not leaking. And I'm gonna check my air compressor, make sure it's mounted securely, not leaking. It's gear driven. Check my power steering pump, make sure it's mounted securely, not leaking. It's also gear driven. Power steering fluid, make sure it's above the refill mark. And I'm gonna check my steering box and hoses, make sure it's mounted securely, not leaking. And hoses are not damaged and not leaking as well. Make sure there's no missing nuts or bolts for the steering box. Then I'm gonna check my steering linkage. I'm gonna check it from the steering box to the wheels. Make sure that there's no that they're not worn or broken. Check the joints and sockets. Make sure that they're not worn or loose. Check for any loose or missing nuts, bolts, or cotter pins. Then I'm gonna check my spring mounts and hangers. Make sure that the spring attachments, such as the bolts, brackets, or bushings, are in place. Make sure my spring hangers, which are right here, are not damaged or cracked. Then I'm gonna look for any loose or missing bushings, which are in here. And I'm gonna check my leaf springs, make sure they're not shifted, missing, broken, or cracked. Check my U-bolts, make sure that they're not broken, missing, or loose, including the U-bolts. Check my shock absorber, make sure it's mounted securely and not leaking. Then I'm going to check my brake hoses, make sure that they're not frayed, damaged, and not leaking. And check my fittings and couplings, make sure that they're secure and not leaking and can supply air. Steering chamber, brake chamber, make sure that it's no cracks, dents, or holes. Make sure it's mounted securely and not leaking. No loose or missing clamps. And I'm gonna check my slack adjuster push rod. Make sure my slack adjuster is mounted securely. Check my slack adjuster push rod for any loose, missing, cracked, or broken parts. By hand with the brakes released, I'll move the push rod, make sure it doesn't move. Make sure it moves approximately 1 inch. Then from here, I'm gonna check my brake drums and liners. Make sure my brake drums have no cracks, dents, or holes. Also look for any loose bolts or missing bolts. Make sure that my brake liners are not worn dangerously thin. Also look for any contaminants such as grease or oil on the brake drum and liners. Then I'm going to check my tires, check the tire inflation, make sure it's proper, check it with a tire gauge, check the tire condition, make sure that the tread is worn evenly, no cuts or damages to the tread or the sidewall. Check the tread depth in the front, make sure it's 4/32 at least, a minimum. Then I'm going to check my rims, make sure there's no bent or damaged rims. Also make sure there's no welding repairs. Look for any rust trails that could indicate that the rim is loose from the wheel. I missed on my tire, you got to check your valve cap and stem. to make sure it's not damaged, missing, or bent. So then I'm going to go to my lug nuts, make sure that they're present, not loose. Look for any rust trails coming from the lug nuts. Make sure there's no radiating cracks coming from the lug bolt holes, or no distortion coming from the bolt holes. And then I'm going to check my hub oil seal, make sure it's not leaking and at adequate level. Pushing here to my door mounts and hangers. Check all internal and external mirrors for make sure that they're mounted properly, clean, and clear of excessive dust. Check my doors, make sure they can open and close properly. Check the hinges, make sure they're in place and secure. Then check my door seal, make sure that it's intact. And I'm gonna check my fuel tank and fuel cap, make sure my fuel tank's mounted securely, my fuel cap is tight, neither are leaking. Now I'll check my feet, however you say it. Make sure I have properly mounted and properly charged fire extinguisher, spare electrical fuses, 3 reflective warning triangles. Side of the tractor, make sure that my clearance lights or reflectors are not broken, missing, and proper color. Check the rear of the tractor and in front of the trailer. Clearance lights. Make sure all my clearance lights are present, not broken, clean, and proper color.
Where are the clearance lights?
There's none on the back of this one, but
Okay.
some truck down. My header board. Make sure it doesn't have any damages or bends in it. Make sure all the rivets aren't missing. Make sure none are missing. Air connectors. Make sure that they're in good condition and not damaged. Also check the glad hands. Make sure they're locked in place and not damaged. I'm gonna check the air hoses. Make sure that they're not tangled, crinched, pinched, frayed, chafed, taped, or worn, and not loose, dragging on the tractor parts. Check my electrical connectors from the trailer and the truck. Make sure that they're in good condition and locked in place. Check my electrical lines. Make sure that they're not tangled, crimped, pinched. The electrical insulation isn't cracked or cut. Make sure they're not chafed, taped, spliced, or worn, or dragging on the tractor parts. Sorry, hold on. Catwalk and steps, make sure they're secured to the frame and solid and free of any foreign objects. Go over this more. Check my frame. Check the longitudinal frame members. Make sure they're not cracked, damaged. Also check the cross members. Make sure they're not damaged, missing, or cracked. And I'm gonna check my drive shaft. Make sure it's not twisted, bent, or broken, and free of any foreign objects. Check the U-joints to make sure that they appear solidly in place. I'm gonna check my torsion bar. Make sure it's not damaged and solidly in place, mounted securely. From there, I'm gonna go to brakes. Check my brake hoses and lines. Make sure that they're not damaged or frayed. Check the couplings and fittings. Make sure they're secure, not leaking and can't supply air. Check my brake chamber. No cracks, dents, or holes. Also look for any loose or missing clamps. Make sure it's not leaking and mounted securely. And then I'm going to check my slack adjuster push rod, which is right here. Make sure that it's mounted securely. The slack adjuster push rod doesn't have any missing, bent, broken, or cracked parts. With the brakes released, check the deflection of the push rod.
Where's the push rod?
Push rod is down at the bottom. It's right here. See it? It goes up and down into there.
Okay.
Okay. No, this is the push rod. I'm sorry. It goes into the brake chamber. Sorry, my bad. It comes out and in of the brake chamber. Okay, so check with the brakes release. Check the push rod by hand. Pull it. Make sure it doesn't move more than approximately 1 inch. I'm gonna check my brake drums and liners. Make sure that they're not cracked, dent, or broken. No holes. Check for any loose or missing bolts. And then make sure the brake liners aren't worn dangerously thin. Also look for any contaminants such as grease or oil. Rear drive axle. I'm gonna check the spring mounts and hangers, which are right here. This is the spring mount and hanger. Make sure it's not cracked. Look, check the spring attachments, which is the bushings, bolts, and brackets. Make sure that they're in place. Check my spring hangers to make sure they're not cracked or damaged. Also look for any damaged or missing bushings. Then I'm going to check my leaf springs. Make sure they're not shifted, missing, broken, or cracked. Check my U-bolts right here. Make sure that they're not loose or missing, including the U-bolts, no nuts. I'm going to check my shock absorbers, make sure that they're mounted securely and not leaking. Then I'm going to check my airbag mounting, make sure they're in place and not damaged. Check my airbag, make sure it's not damaged and not leaking. I'm going to go to side of coupling system. Make sure check my apron, which is right here. Make sure that it's not cracked, damaged, or broken. I'm gonna check the gap. Make sure that the trailer is resting flat on the fifth wheel skid plate. Make sure there's no space between the fifth wheel skid plate and the apron. And I'm gonna check my fifth wheel skid plate. Make sure it's properly lubricated. Release arm, which is on the other side. Make sure that it's let's go to the other side so you can see that. Check my release arm. Make sure that it's secure and all the way in. Make sure it's in the engaged position. And I'm gonna check my safety latch. Make sure that it's in place. Then I'm gonna check my platform. Make sure that there's no damages to the platform structure, which supports the fifth wheel skid plate. Then I'm gonna check my sliding fifth wheel. Check for leaks in the airline, which is right over here. So the airline, I'm gonna check. Look for leaks in the airline. Look for loose or missing pins in the sliding mechanism of the fifth wheel. Make sure the locking pins are fully engaged. Check that fifth wheel is properly positioned to the tractor frame, so the tractor frame will clear the landing gear. Check my mounting bolts. Check for loose or missing bolts, clamps, nuts, or brackets. Check that both fifth wheel and sliding mounting appear solidly in place. Check my bud spacing. Make sure that it's even all the way around, not damaged and free of any foreign objects. Check my tire inflation. Make sure proper tire inflation with a tire gauge. Check my tire condition. Make sure the tread's worn evenly. No cuts or damages to the tread or sidewall. Check my valve cap and stem, which is right here. Make sure it's not missing, bent, or broken. Check the tread depth of the rear of the tractor. Make sure it's a minimum of 2 30-seconds. I'm gonna check my rim. Make sure I don't have any bent or damaged rims. Make sure there's no welding repairs. No rust trails that could indicate the rim is loose from the wheel. Check my lug nuts. Make sure that they're present and not loose. Look for any rust trails coming from the lug nuts. Make sure there's no radiating cracks coming from the lug bolts holes. No distortion coming from the bolt holes. And then I'm going to check my axle seal. Make sure that it's not leaking and at adequate level. Locking jaws. Check that the fifth wheel locking jaws are in place, secure around the kingpin. Check the kingpin lock. Make sure that the locking jaws are holding the kingpin in place. Make sure the kingpin is not bent or damaged. Check the rear lights and reflectors. Check that clearance lights and tail lights are not broken, in proper color. Reflectors are clean and none missing. Make sure and not broken. Make sure the reflector tape is present and securely affixed to the vehicle. Check my splash guards, make sure they're mounted securely and not damaged. Then we check the frame under here. Check for cracks or bends in the longitudinal frame members. Check for loose, cracked, bent, broken, or missing cross members. Look for breaks or holes in the box or the floor of the trailer. And I'm going to check my landing gear right here. Check that the landing gear is fully raised, no missing parts. Crank handle is secure, and the support frame and landing pads are not damaged. Check the side of the trailer. Check the clearance lights and turn signals are not missing, broken, and are proper color. Reflector tape is securely affixed to the vehicle. I'm going to check my brake hoses. Which are right here. Check those brake hoses. Make sure that they look for cracks, worn, or frays. All couplings and fittings are secure, not leaking, and can't supply air. Also these hoses too. Back here I'm going to check a brake chamber, look for cracks, dents, or holes, or any loose or missing clamps. Make sure it's not leaking and secured properly. Check my slack adjuster push rod by hand. Make sure the slack adjuster is mounted securely and the slack adjuster push rod doesn't have any bent, broken, missing, or loose parts. With the brakes released by hand, I'll pull the push rod, make sure it doesn't move approximately more than 1 inch. Then I'm going to check my brake drums and liners, look for any cracks, dents, or holes. Also check for any loose or missing bolts. Brake drum and linings are free of contaminants such as grease or oil. Front trailer axle, my tandem release. Right here, make sure the locking pins are locked in place and release arm is secure. Spring mounts and hangers, look for the attachments such as bushings, bolts, and brackets. Make sure the spring hangers are not damaged or cracked. Also look for any loose or missing bushings. Then I'm going to check my leaf springs, make sure they're not missing, cracked, or broken, or damaged. Check my U-bolts, make sure I don't have any missing nuts, bolts, or loose bolts such as the U-bolts. And then I'm going to check my torsion bar torque arm right here, make sure it's mounted securely and not damaged. Check my bud spacing, make sure there's just even space, not damaged and free of any foreign objects. Then I'm going to check my tire inflation on the trailer, make sure and check for proper tire inflation with the tire gauge. Check the tire condition, make sure the tread is worn evenly, no cuts or damages to the tread or the sidewall. Also, make sure the valve cap and stem are not damaged, missing, or broken. Check the tread depth on the trailer, make sure it's a minimum of 2 30-seconds.